Welcome, everybody. I'm Craig Budner, together with my colleague Chico Chitsike, and we're really honored today to be with Hans Albers from Juniper Networks, the Chief of Staff. And Hans, I think you're going to find, has a really interesting, varied set of experiences. He's been in the technology space since the late 80s, so he's seen a lot of change. He's now the president of ACC Europe, and this is the third in the series, but one I'm really, really excited about. I think you're going to hear about a range of topics that will trigger your imagination about how to do things more efficiently in your organizations, how to think about dealing with your clients in a way that will resonate with them, and how to adapt and help your clients find a seat at the business table in a changing legal environment. So thank you very much for doing this. And of course, we're in Amsterdam.
Thanks very much, Craig, for having me, and it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Beautiful day here in Amsterdam.
Yep.
I guess I brought the weather.
Sounds like it.
Yes. So let's start with a little bit about your background that predates becoming a lawyer. You know, what led you to becoming a lawyer? What, you know, any interesting stories from your childhood that we ought to know about before we get going?
Well, you know, I was as a high school student, I was interested in a couple of things, and you know, the main one was history, actually. And you know, I'd always had the plan to study history at university. But then, you know, as the day of making the choice came closer, I had second thoughts. And I was also interested in politics. So I was like, okay, what do I do? History, politics, or maybe even English, literature, right? Now that fell away fairly quickly. But I settled on law, but mainly because of an interest in politics. And I never, ever thought that I would become a lawyer in a law firm, a criminal lawyer. That was never my plan. And I looked at, you know, my father worked in a retail business. He was he was a sales guy, but he was in a big retail organization, the largest in the country, actually, very large in the US as well. And you know, one day he had this little leaflet from his company that had an interview with their only and first in-house lawyer. Now imagine this was back in the 80s, 70s probably even, and you know, this was a multi-billion-dollar company that had one lawyer. So I figured, oh, that sounds like a pretty cool job, actually, to be an in-house lawyer. And then kind of forgot about that for a long time. But I decided to go into law school. There's a lot of things I found interesting in law school. It was mostly constitutional law because of the interest in politics, and philosophy. Contract law, corporate law, didn't really appeal that much, but guess what? That's what I ended up doing anyway. But the choices led to law school in a slightly different direction. I could have gone in a different way. I remember once after I graduated, I had a chat with a recruiter who predicted that I would end my career in politics. Mm-hmm. It's not too late. It's still a possibility that might happen, although it's it's unlikely. It's unlikely at this point. But that was his prediction, and you know, you never know.
You never know. Anything your dad told you about the general counsel or the position, about being a lawyer, that you remember that stuck with you?
Not really. No, I think, you know, he never really dealt with the lawyers. Mm-hmm. I mean, that wasn't that important at the time. What I did learn from him, I think, is his leadership style. Yeah. He managed a fairly large organization, and he was always extremely approachable for his team, for his organization, very flexible, and always had a listening ear for the people who worked for him. So I think that I learned more from him in terms of his leadership style, and I observed that because, you know, sometimes he would drag me along, and after I had my driver's license, I could drive him around during the holidays because he was always on the road, and he said, "You can drive me around." So, you know, got to see a lot of his business and the way he managed people.
What an experience to be able to do that. And so I guess what I'm getting from you is that your dad really had a style where he didn't view himself as superior to anybody in his organization.
No.
Yeah, what a wonderful lesson to get at that.
Well, and then he sort of,
life.
you know, he grew up through the organization. He never went. He had no formal education after, you know, elementary school. Never went to university because that was during the war and there was just no time. And that's how he started his career.
That's great. We could probably take that down a much longer path than we have time for. That's fascinating. So you've been, you know, your career's really been in technology.
Right.
Before technology was a thing, whether it, I mean, you know, kind of you were involved with the IBM of Europe, Cisco, Juniper for a long time now. Anything attract you to technology? Or was that just you started there and it kept going?
It was, to be honest, more accidental than by design, I would say. When I was in law school, they were just starting to talk about technology, and you know, the technology law was a new thing, and I kind of gave it not much consideration. I thought like, oh, this is just a fling, you know, who knows where this will go. Computers, yeah, whatever. But then, you know, my first job in technology was actually at the computer business of Nokia. Back in 1989, I think, or 90. Nobody had ever heard of Nokia. No one had ever heard of Nokia, no idea what they were doing. They were making rubber boots and tires and radios and TVs and a mobile device, which was that big.
Right.
So that's how I sort of, you know, and during the interview process, obviously, the general manager asked me, are you interested in computers and technology? And I said, yes, of course, I'm very interested in technology. I never had touched a computer. So that was a bit of a learning curve, but it was great. I mean, and the reason for me, I stayed in technology for all these years, first you had like a real physical product that you could see, you could touch, you could work with, you could see this thing develop. But it was a very dynamic business. It was always evolving. There were new things happening. There was acquisitions. There was mergers. There was always something going on. So even though I think most of my jobs I stayed in more or less around 10, 11 years, but it never felt like that was 10 or 11 years because there was always changes happening, organization changing, technology changing. You know, that was always very exciting. And especially back when I joined Cisco in 2000, you know, that was the height of the internet bubble. It was about to burst. Yeah. I don't take the blame for that one. But it was back in 2000, you know, it was like crazy times, right? But, you know, we were rolling out 3G. This was way before 4 and 5G, but this was the sort of starting point of where we were rolling out 3G. And I remember talking to some of our customers. And Nokia, by the way, then had become a customer of Cisco. We were talking about the possibilities of mobile devices, and people were talking about, oh yeah, but people will be watching video on their phones and sending messages and all that. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. Why would I want to watch a video on this smaller screen?
Right.
Well, guess what everybody does today, right? So these predictions that I heard back in those days came through.
So what did you do, you know, not being an engineer, obviously, you know, we're birds of a feather in the philosophy and history loves.
Right.
Not being really an engineer, not necessarily having this aptitude for understanding how the technology worked. What did you do to allow yourself to be able to talk to the business people you were representing?
I think, you know, as a lawyer in the technology business, there's two things that are, I think, really, well, maybe three, but certainly two things that are important is first and foremost, you need to understand your business model, right? How does your business operate? I mean, does it license software? Does it sell products? Does it work through channels or distribution or whatever? So really understand your go-to-market model. How do you actually sell the technology that you have? And then, you know, I think that's first and foremost. Secondly, I think it is important you get some degree of understanding of the technology, you know, and I've sat through some pretty complex, training on networking technology and how this all worked and what the difference is between a router and a switch. And obviously, not being an engineer, you only remember the basics. But that's enough, right? You think, when you have conversations with the sales organizations, or actually when you are in negotiations with customers about technology agreements, selling technology, you need to have a fair degree of understanding of how your product works. And if you're selling a network solution like we do at Juniper, we sell networking solutions in various shapes and forms, you do need to have an understanding of how the basics work, right? I don't need to have an ability to program software or write code, but it is helpful to understand what these people do, that your colleagues are doing, how the sales guys are doing it, and especially when it comes to customer negotiations or resolving issues, problems, whatever you may come across, it's very important that you have a sense of your own technology. And as you sort of gradually work through these things, you learn more about these things, and you have to ask a lot of questions, right? I mean, I remember one instance where many years ago, when data privacy became a much more important topic, I had a conversation with customers who had all sorts of questions about how our products and networks were dealing with data and privacy-related data. And I had to talk to our engineers to say, okay, what is actually possible, right? And I didn't always like the answers, because there was a lot more possible than I had accounted for in the discussions, and that you can actually get to a lot more data than you would think. Or that sometimes I learned that I thought our product the data was just passing through, but there are devices that actually store the data. So then you need to take that into account when that device needs to be repaired or replaced. You need to do something.
Creates vulnerability to
right.
Yeah.
So but you learn that only by asking questions, and I think that's often an important role for an in-house lawyer. I think is to ask the right questions.
Did you have a go-to person? Do you recall a point where the light bulb went off, where you had a person who was an engineer who kind of mentored you in the education to understand your products?
There was never one person. I think there was a multiple people that you would talk to, and some engineers are really good at explaining how things work, and then others, you lose them after 10 seconds, right?
Yeah.
But you come across, you have to find the right people, and then you learn more about what you actually are dealing with.
Yeah. Well, it's also it sounds like being willing to admit you don't understand something first.
Right,
yeah.
Right, definitely. I think that's a fundamental beginning of asking the questions, right? Is that, okay, I have no idea what we're talking about, let's figure it out. Mm-hmm. And then if you're armed with with that knowledge, it makes you a much stronger in-house lawyer.
Yeah. One of the things I've been really impressed as I've gotten to know you, and I've had the pleasure of being really had a close look at ACC Europe for almost 5 years now, and I find the events, and I'm not just saying this, I find them really, really interesting. I think the balance of outside counsel and in-house lawyers is fantastic, and also just the involvement at the events. So it's really terrific. But one of the things that it seems like you bring to that conversation, if you will, and maybe you bring it more and more as you're the president, is an understanding of the United States. I mean, you spent time in your early part of your career in the United States. Was that intentional? What did you learn about the differences between how they do business in Europe versus how you do business in the United States as it pertained to your role? Yes,
I spent 2.5 years in working in California. And that was an opportunity that arose. I was always open to the opportunity. Wasn't necessarily actively pursuing it, but the opportunity came, and it's one of those moments in your life, in your career, where you go figure, okay, I had 3 kids, they're all in school, and one was going to high school, and the other one was about 2 as well, and it's pretty upsetting for the whole family, right? And we had a long discussion about it over dinner, well, a couple of dinners, I suppose, right, and not one dinner. And it's easy to think about 100 reasons why you shouldn't do it, right? Because your dad's not well. You just bought the house. We just actually redecorated the house. Kids going to high school. All these reasons. And then we said, well, heck, let's just do it. Let's just do it. I mean, what do we got to lose?
Yeah.
Right? And we spent 2.5 years in California, which is a fantastic experience as a family, because it brings you closer, because you're going through all these changes, and you don't have your usual network of friends and family around. Mm-hmm. So, and from a business perspective, getting the opportunity to work at headquarters is very eye-opening, I would say. It gives you a chance to look at how corporate works, because obviously I was at the sort of, the European subsidiary end, and then you're in the corporate headquarters. It helps you understand much better what drives them, what is important to them. You obviously get to know the folks in headquarters. You bump into CEO when you're going up for a coffee. Those kind of opportunities are kind of fun. But learning more about the corporate culture and the corporate business is very helpful. Working as a lawyer in the US, a non-US lawyer working in the US is pretty darn scary, right? So you learn a lot of things, because in Europe we sometimes tend to think like, okay, well, a lot of people will say, wow, doing business in the US is way more easier than in Europe, right? Europe is all these different countries and European laws, and it's complicated. Well, actually, I found that probably the US is equally, if not more, complicated. And not just because of claims and litigation and all that sort of stuff, but you have the different state laws, you have the federal laws. It's not really clear. Yeah. And I asked a question once to one of my public sector lawyers. I said, look, I'd like to get an overview of all the public procurement laws in all 50 states. Go find a law firm who does that and all that. And my guy said, well, not one law firm that does all that. Most law firms cover a number of states, and probably now maybe more, but that was not that easy. And then I think there's a lot of regulations in the US regulating how business is done, and this was the time of Sarbanes-Oxley being introduced, and that was pretty complicated stuff. So it led me to the conclusion that doing business in the US is on the whole, maybe even more complicated than it is in Europe.
What was one lesson, if there was one notable lesson, whether it was cultural or business or legal, that you took from your experience in the United States, other than your observation of the landscape there?
I think the sort of the one observation I would say is that doing business in the U.S. and being in the legal department in the U.S. takes you need, because of litigation and the litigation risks, you need to be really thorough. In most countries in Europe, I would say it's slightly different. The UK is probably closest to the US culture because of the difference between common and civil law systems. So you have a different approach to contracting and how you view risk. In civil law systems, you can still rely on a court or a judge applying some sense of common sense into the question of, okay, is this a right or not, right? And that was slightly different, right? Working for a US company, and then especially in the US, you have that different view of risk.
A lot of nuance in the calculation.
Yeah.
What was there one thing that you in dealing with US lawyers, was there a pet peeve that you came away with? Was there something you observed, boy, if I was in their shoes, I would have done this a little differently?
Well, they can be argumentative to the extreme, I would say. I would say working with U.S. lawyers and U.S. law firms is very very insightful, because they're very good. I think they're very well trained and they're very smart. Sometimes I could sit in a meeting, with my colleagues within the in-house department, the team that I was part of, they could argue about a particular legal point on an IP indemnity clause for like hours.
Right.
And you go, guys, come on, let's move on.
We're dancing on the head of a pin right
Yeah,
now.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's different from European culture, I think.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So along the way, I mean, I've seen you in action. In my judgment, you're an incredible leader, and I'm sure if I were to walk around Juniper, I would see that at an even more atomic level. Was there something along the way, maybe a failure that you had in your career that was an enduring lesson, whenever it might have been, whether it was in your childhood or your professional career?
Well, I'm sure there's been many failures, and I think the one lesson I learned as a manager, this is one thing that comes to mind. As a manager, you obviously have responsibility for the activities of your team, and you have oversight, and you trust them to do the right thing. You trust them to be responsive and accountable for what they're responsible for. But there was one case where somebody went on maternity leave. We had a temporary cover. Somebody took over. It was not in my location. It was a different location, and that person was as a paralegal basically, responsibility for ensuring that contracts were renewed on time. And I kind of assumed that was happening because her predecessor did that, and I was assuming that she did the same. Well, we found out that she didn't. Those contracts disappeared. So I discovered that at some point a lot of our contracts had expired, and that would create all sorts of problems from a revenue and accounting perspective. So this was like this moment where you go like, okay, now I have to fess up and call my boss and say, we have a problem, right? And then it makes you think like, okay, I should have paid more attention to this. I should have been more on top of this. I just let this go. And there's always excuses why you let it go, but and then the other important thing is, okay, well, it happened. I now know what the situation is. I can now make a plan of action to fix it, but I do have to come clean.
Yeah.
And that's what my boss said at the time. He said, look, I appreciate you telling me this. It's shit, it's not good, it's bad. You dropped the ball completely, and it's going to create some havoc, but
You didn't make the second mistake.
Right, and now you're going to fix it.
Yeah, what a great lesson. I mean, how many people want to resist the reality that there was a mistake made?
Right.
And that's really oftentimes what's the big disaster.
Right.
What a great lesson for lawyers of all ages to kind of benefit from. Thank you for sharing that. The failures are never easy to talk about. Bring back nightmares. I'm sure you lost a little sleep on that.
Well, absolutely. But you also realize it's going to come out anyway.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no point in trying to hide it. And being part of being a leader, being a manager, it means also taking the blame.
Yeah.
This was my responsibility.
Yeah.
Right. Now, in politics, they would say, okay, I have to resign. I didn't have to do that, but let's just move on but let's fix it.
Yeah.
Let's fix it ASAP.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you've written and spoken on creating efficiencies in departments. You've talked a fair amount about some of the tools you've used to run a multi-jurisdiction team, which Juniper obviously has.
Yeah.
What are some things? Touch on that a little bit. What are some things that you've seen evolve and how you lead a cross-cultural, cross-geographic, in some ways, cross-discipline team?
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that it takes an extra effort, right? If you lead a multinational team with cultural differences, but also because you're not in the same location, you have to be very proactive. You have to call people more frequently than maybe you would normally do, right? Because if you're all in the same location, you bump into each other, you have a coffee in the morning, you have a chat during lunch. But if you're spread out across Europe or even the US, right? I mean, it takes an extra effort to bring them together every once in a while, whether that's a weekly call or a quarterly meeting. But especially make sure that you talk to the people on your team actively, right? And also make sure that they understand that you're always available. I mean, I always make myself available. I won't say 24/7 because that's not really true, of course.
Yeah.
But they could call me, anytime, and they did, and they knew they could always pick up the phone. So I think, but it takes an extra effort, and in terms of the cultural differences, you need to be sensitive to that, right? And learn more about, the cultural differences and the subtleties of language. One of the best books that I read on this topic, which is a culture map by Aaron Meyer. And I only read it like a few years ago, so it was always too late actually, because I'd already done all that stuff. But you read some of these things and you go like, oh, I recognize that.
Yeah.
Right? I know that if I'm saying, and I've had that occasion, just a small example of cultural nuances, right? If my American boss would ask me, hey, how's it going? And I would say, yeah, it's okay. And he would go like, what's wrong? Right? Whereas in England, if I would say it's okay, they would just move on and wouldn't pay attention. Because like, okay, he's okay. He said he's okay. He's fine. Right? But, the cultural differences play through in communications very much. So I enjoyed that book, and I'm very glad that Aaron will be speaking at our conference next year in Brussels.
What a treat.
So she's agreed to be I think she's going to be a closing keynote speaker.
Fantastic.
So she's fantastic. So I'm really glad with that.
Oh, that's great. Well, I know somebody is smiling down on you as you talk about the lessons of being available and listening, and it's so true that when we get in positions where people are intimidated to reach out to you because of your title, you're missing all sorts of feedback information that helps you do your job better.
Absolutely.
But I see some of your dad's lessons coming through. That's fantastic. Well, so are there? What would be? I mean, Aaron's book is an example, but is there a book that you would recommend that would be non-legal to one of your young understudies that they might not gravitate to without the suggestion?
Well, one of the the books that I recently read was, Simon Sinek's Start With Why, right? Yeah. And, again, it's somehow almost an eye-opener, right? But if you sort of read these thoughts, his ideas around, why some businesses are successful and others are not, and you can apply this, and we actually had discussions about this within the legal department, right? I mean, why do we do what we do? Is it just because they get the paycheck at the end of the month, or do we actually believe in something, and do we want to achieve something? So I thought that was a really interesting read, and one that I would recommend to a lot of people because we talked a lot about that in our last legal offsite. And it made people think about, okay, well, why am I doing this, and why do I make a problem of this? And, but start with the why is really a good point of looking at your day-to-day activities. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
Right.
No,
and if you can't articulate that, you better take a step back.
Better take a step back. Yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit into I have this on the mind a little bit because I was at a general counsel roundtable in Dallas that we hosted with some folks, and we had an FBI cybersecurity person, and he spent a good part of the dinner scaring the crap out of the GCs in the room about what's going on in the world of cybersecurity, both from a state-sponsored cybersecurity as well as white-collar crime that's gotten involved in it. Juniper's right there in the middle of it, and you are a leader in the discussion around being a general counsel and helping business people look around the corner to solve business problems. Where do you see the data privacy issue? I mean, we all know about GDPR and the risk, and everybody's got to comply with the regulation, but where do you see that the tangible risk for companies like yours that sit in the tech space on this cyber warfare that's going on out there?
Well, it's an extremely complex set of issues, and one that sort of all linked together. One of the things that I've seen, certainly in the last, 5 to 8 years, this has really become a topic top of mind for the general counsel and the board of any company, where maybe 10 years ago people would say, oh yeah, data privacy, well, okay, we have to deal with the basics of the law and all that, but this was way before cybersecurity became top of mind for everyone. So, we constantly look at our own internal security, our network security, and products, and developing products actually that help customers to secure their networks in an efficient way. You always have to sort of stay ahead of the curve, right? It's a race between the bad guys and the good guys in a way, right? And I think there's a lot businesses can do, and I think we constantly remind them of that really need to invest in getting this right. You cannot afford not to do it right. And we have large customers with big data centers and cloud providers for whom it is also top of mind and a complex issue. But you still see smaller companies, smaller players who don't necessarily have the knowledge or the resources to deal with all of this. So we can help them bring them up to speed. The other thing which we actively involved in is also at the sort of government level and at the Washington level, is making sure we're involved with policymakers and governments to work with the agenda around cybersecurity policies, because that impacts the governments, and government obviously an important customer for us too, imports business and imports international trade.
Thank you. That seems like very practical advice. I mean, I know you can't completely avoid these attacks, but right. you've got to do enough to make them not threats to the institution.
And of course, you need to raise awareness amongst your employees, right? And cybersecurity, to a large degree, also relies on human behavior, right? So don't click on that link, or don't give that information to a third party who's fishing for stuff. Because that's how a lot of hacks happen, right? So you need to have proper training and education of your organization. You need to repeat that constantly, because people are sometimes, innocently thinking like, oh, well, this is probably okay, right? And then, or people, fishing for information, and it could also be calling up the HR organization, right, asking for employee data or information. These are all forms of, breaches, I suppose, right? So education, training, and awareness of your employees is a really important aspect of this.
Good first defense.
Yeah.
So throughout this interview today, which has been really interesting, you've imbued your answers with always some practical business advice. And in fact, if I understand from your bio, you actually sat on the European board of Cisco. You've always had a proverbial seat at the business table. Your title, Chief of Staff, reflects a business focus for your role, not just a pure legal focus. And we've talked about that at the last couple of ACC Europe annual events. How did you find your voice? There's so many in-house lawyers out there looking for a way to get that seat at the table
right.
from a business perspective. How were you able to find your voice to get that seat?
I think it's mostly through being proactively getting yourself involved and expressing an interest and expressing an opinion, right? And how do you get involved in these things? Because you see things happening and you comment on it, and you have an opinion and you talk about it, right? And when our new GC started, well, it's like 4 or 5 years ago now, we talked about things that were, what my view was on the department, and I said, well, we should do more with technology. We should look at these processes, and that wasn't not with the intent of like, okay, I'm the one going to do that. But that's what ultimately he said after a couple of discussions. He said, I want you to take the lead on this. And that's often how these things go, right? You put your hand up and say, look, I think we can do this differently. And that's how I've seen also in other parts of your organization is if you look at the teams that I've managed and worked with, the ones who are successful and who progress and move up the ranks are the people who say, you know what, I'll do it, right? I see a problem, I'll fix it. Or there is an executive, that somebody needs to talk to, I'll do it. And sometimes you have to be willing to go in the deep end, right? You don't always know what you're getting into. And this is, for some lawyers, this doesn't come natural, right? Because lawyers tend to be risk averse. They want to get the lay of the land. They want to know exactly what's going on. But I think, the people who are willing to stick their head out and say, look, I think I can do this. Right. And then as a manager, you need to make sure that they have backing and, you're there to help them and support them if they struggle. But most of the times they're fine.
Yeah, it seems like that confidence has to come with that curiosity that you mentioned earlier, where you're engaging with business people to understand the guts, so that when you do speak up, you do with some authority. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Is there something, you've led these teams and people have spoken about your leadership and management of teams. Are there mechanisms you use? You mentioned your team retreat. What are ways you keep your team together and you trumpet the principles that you mentioned, that, hey, you got to raise your hand, you got to own it, and sometimes it's not all about a legal technical answer?
Well, I think not. I think it's a lot is about being, if you look at the teams and how they partner with the business, I think they need to be available. They need to be visible as well, right? Don't hide in your office somewhere on the 5th floor, right? Just go out there and go be close to the business. They're not going to, it's one of the big differences for people that I hear who move from a law firm and come and work at a law department. The first thing they will probably tell you after 6 months is that, like, I actually have to go find, what's going on in the business, because in the law firm the work will come to you, right, automatically. But in a business it doesn't. You need to go out and talk to people, and I always like to call this the coffee machine review. If I would go to the London office, and usually I would pick up my first questions on my way into the office on the way to the coffee machine, people would say, oh, now I see you, I have a question for you. Can you help me with this, that, and the other? So you have to be visible, right? If you're never in the office or you don't visit the other offices, people are not going to ask you a question. They're going to forget who you are, right? And they're going to go on the web and they go like, oh, we have a lawyer somewhere, where is he, right? So you have to be visible, and then you make them feel you're part of the organization, part of their team as well, right? And same with negotiations, I think. And this is, again, we talked about cultural differences earlier between the US and Europe. In terms of customer engagement and customer negotiations, in the US, it's pretty much the standard that most of their customer meetings and engagements happen through conference calls. While here, you will have customers who will say on a Friday night, actually Monday morning there's a meeting in Luxembourg and I want you to be there. And you go like, oh, right. And I've had those cases where I got a call the night before, you have to be in Hamburg tomorrow morning because we have a customer negotiation and I need the lawyers to be there. Oh, right, okay. So you have to be flexible as well, right? Especially, this is mostly true in the technology space that I'm used to. Of course, it doesn't happen in every industry, and it depends on the role. But in Europe, even though there's also travel and distances and all that, it still is appreciated to have face-to-face meetings, even if it's only for the first couple of times, and then later on, a lot of things will be done over the phone or by email. But in the US, people go like, it's too far away. I'm not going to fly to the East Coast. It's too hard. It's a difference.
It's how you learn the communication nuances you talked about that you picked up from being in the U.S. for 2.5 years.
Right.
you've got to actually do the eyeball so you get the full communication picture.
Right.
That's great.
Right.
So, obviously you've taken on a lot in a very fast-moving industry that you've been in since the late 80s. What is there one thing that if you were speaking to the younger lawyers out there that you did to what I would call hack your habits? I just finished a book by James Clear called Atomic Habits, and he talks about positive habit stacking. And I remember I used to sit there and I get a million emails and I would respond to them immediately, and
Right.
and actually learned that if I waited and did them every couple 3 hours, that I could be far more efficient and use that time to go converse, as you suggest, walk the halls, do whatever.
Yeah.
Is there a trick? Is there something that you kind of look back on and go, I created some efficiencies here?
Well, I'm not sure there's a magic trick, unfortunately, Craig, but I think you have to somehow protect your own agenda somehow. And I think as a manager, it's important as well that you give people the feeling that that's possible. And I remember, and there was an eye-opening moment for me back when I joined Cisco back in 2000. I had and that was a very, very crazy time. It was a very dynamic time. The business was growing exponentially like crazy, 60% year-on-year growth, and doubling the business every year. It was like crazy. So there was always work, right? And there was always emails, and there was always meetings to go to, conference calls to attend. But it was my boss at the time, the now General Counsel of Cisco, Mark Chandler, who said to me, look, on a Wednesday afternoon, I go home at 4 o'clock, I go coach my son's baseball team, I think it was. And that's important. And family always comes first, he said, right? And I've always applied that throughout my career for myself or my team, that you make sure, and that sometimes it's a hassle, right? I mean, especially if you're working in Europe with the US and there's conference calls with the US, you always have to sort of figure out, okay, is there 30 minutes that I can actually have dinner with the family or what, right? So you have to protect that. But, as a manager, you can set the tone, right? And say, this is important. And if you have a sick child at home, go home, right? If you have another family emergency, deal with it. There's a large organization around you. We'll deal with your stuff. It's not the end of the world if you're not there.
Right.
Right. But you have to sort of figure out what's the right way to do this. I mean, I had once a young lawyer in my team who showed up for a team offsite, even though the day before she went home because her son, I think her young son, was sick, and she showed up again the next morning, and I said, oh, okay, glad you're back. Is he all right? No, he's in hospital. I said, what are you doing here? Get out of here. Get out of here.
Yeah. It's making sure that reactions don't creep in to change your day.
Right.
And I love the message of valuing what's most important, because, I mean, if your employees aren't able to serve their families,
Yeah.
they're not going to last with you very long, are they?
No, we do give, and we do have these days, thanks to all the technology we have a fair degree of flexibility,
Yeah.
right? So it's okay if people say, look, at 6 o'clock I'm going to sit down for dinner, I'm going to take the kids to bed or whatever, needs doing. But then, you might log on back at 8 o'clock and spend 1 more hour, 2 more hours dealing with stuff. And some people like to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning before the family wakes up. It's all down to personal choices. But, make those choices. And don't feel like you have to be on for 24/7, because you don't.
So one more topic dealing with how, I know you manage outside counsel for the company.
Yeah.
What are, you've also been significantly involved in kind of this new world we're all living in, which is legal operations and procurement and understanding metrics. Are there things that you would tell young partners, senior associates out there from a client perspective about how they could handle one of your matters better, or things that if you were in their shoes you would be focused on at their stage of the game?
I think, the feedback I often give to the law firms is, first of all, make an effort and invest in getting to understand our business, right? And that works two ways as well. We need to understand the firm we work with, but it takes an extra effort. But also, I think, as a law firm, talk about all the other things you bring to the table, right? And I've sometimes pestered them a little bit about, okay, well, you talk about innovation, but show me the innovation, right? Where is the actual innovation happening? It's not just talk, or is it something for real? But this is an ongoing dialogue about understanding each other's needs. As a GC, you have priorities, you have challenges, you have a budget to manage as well, which is sometimes forgotten by our friends in the law firms, right? And we actually have a budget for things, and that budget is pretty much, prescriptive about how much we can actually spend. So, try to understand each other's needs. And as well, we had an interesting discussion the other day, again, about the topic as well, about, work-life balance, right? I mean, as a client, we have the luxury of saying, I want this done by Sunday night. But does it really have to be done by Sunday night? Or can you also say, end of business on Monday is fine too, right? Because if you're going to say on Friday to the law firm, I want this done by Sunday, there's some people, some young associate is going to be working away the weekend, right? Is that really needed? Yeah, maybe it is if you're doing a large merger or acquisition and it needs to be close. But, for a lot of other things, it can wait probably, right? So set the right expectations. And I think that's a responsibility that we have as in-house lawyers as well, to be fair. And we need a good result, and we need a affordable result as well. That's important. But law firms, I think, can probably do more in terms of communications about, how they handle a matter, how they staff the matter, what the priorities are, what the possibilities are. And sometimes, I'd like to see the law firms come up more with creative ways of solving a problem, or a cheaper way of solving a problem, and say, look, we can throw 100 bodies at this, or we have a technical solution that maybe does the trick as well. The 100 bodies will be 100 bodies having multiple billable hours, so a nice big bill, or the technology solution which you can provide at a low cost. Guess what the GC really needs, right? I mean, that's the conversation, and that's the challenge I think law firms have. But the clients will ultimately go for the solution that works best for them.
Yeah, you see in these relationships so many conversations between outside counsel and buyers of legal services like you that are about what they're working on at that moment. How do law firms, how do your outside counsel, the ones that do it successfully, go about having a broader conversation that allows them to learn? I mean, really, I'd equate it to what you did with your business people, right? To sit down and say, Hans, I want to talk to you for 2 hours about what keeps you up at night. How do they start those dialogues?
By going to our meetings and coming to our offsites, and we invite them to be there and talk about what they're doing, and they can hear what we're doing. We invite them to come to team meetings to do training and other development sessions, and building the relationship. I mean, that's really what it's all about, and talking and listening to each other and challenging sometimes, it's, and I think probably we can do better in terms of giving feedback if things are not going right. Because what typically happens in a lot of cases that if an in-house lawyer is not happy with the firm, he would just stop using them. He doesn't tell them like, oh, this last piece of work you did was below par and it's not acceptable. Sometimes they will, but not always. They just move on to another firm, right? And you wonder maybe after a year, like, I haven't heard from these guys for a while. What's going on? So I think the ongoing dialogue and I think we're looking at better methodology of measuring the work, and maybe have a sort of satisfaction scorecard or whatever you use that might be helpful. And I saw today a demo of a tool that would allow you to sort of do that more interactive and allow your own organization to have more insight as to which lawyers you use. And hey, this guy in France was pretty good, so I give them some points for that.
Uh-huh. Are there any metrics that procurement, legal ops looks at? The number of lawyers assigned to a matter. Any kind of leading indicators that you're starting to think about as you process data to see if firms are being efficient?
Not yet, but we're thinking about those metrics as well. I mean, we somehow need to get there. And one of the metrics we do actually care about and have started to look at right now is diversity. We care about the diversity. We've done surveys of our firms that we use and how they do in terms of diversity. And the next step is we're actually having a conversation about that fairly soon, is having a conversation about, okay, the goal is that we reward the firms that do well in diversity, who have a proven track record in diversity. And then the idea is that we would award them more business. That's the goal. And I think that's where we're heading.
Yeah, such an important initiative, and seeing firms need to put, not just put diverse lawyers out in front on pitches, but actually have them getting the credit and managing the deals. That's a wonderful actually spot to start to wrap up on. I mean, this has been a really, really interesting discussion for me. Your humility it always does every time I encounter you. It shines through. You're willing to be a little vulnerable. You're willing to kind of learn something new every day. I mean, you can see those traits for how you've gotten to where you've gotten, because you're evolving every day and you're growing. So I know that people out there are going to find this fascinating, like I did. So thank you again.
Thanks, Craig, and look forward to see you at the next conference of ACC.
I'll be there.